are live for our second week.
Second week in a row, and we have another R5 to talk about.
We're not going to refer
a
to
very
which one,
happy camera announcement day. It's been a while since there's been a big camera announcement. There's been a lot of dumb little.
Well, I mean, the camera isn't that big, but I mean,
Oh.
the importance of the camera is quite significant. But
Toby, it's not the
Brandon,
size, it's how you use it.
Brandon knows all about having an oversized camera, so
I now have the biggest camera. I went from the smallest camera to the biggest camera.
I don't think that's true. I think the Z9, no, the Z9 what weighs a little
heavier, not
it's heavier.
Okay. Wait, I don't think Brandon, do you have your Brandon, do you have your R3 right there? Do you have your R3 right there? Kemper, your Z9. Let's do a quick comparison. With Brandon's current lens on there, Brandon's wins.
Kemper, you gotta hold it sideways like this.
Oh, like okay, yeah.
Oh, now they're like, this is like a thumbnail for the versus video we're gonna make. Now we're committed to making that. I regret that massively.
We are committed to making that.
Oh man.
So, well, Sony went and did it. They finally announced a new camera. It's been a long time.
It's been since 2019 for the R5 series or the R series. The A7RV was October, because we did a video on Loveland Pass. You should go check that out after this live stream is over. Where we used the A7R4, and since Kemper used the A7R4 the most, and Brandon used it some as well, I guess I used it just a smidgen. But from your perspective, Kemper, as pretty significant A7R4 user, what are your first impressions on this Sony A7R5?
Okay, so, I've watched the videos. I of course haven't gotten to use one yet. If you would like us to be able to try out these cameras and have an embargo and all that, definitely hit that like button and subscribe right now, because they did not send us a camera to try out. So I had to watch a lot of videos.
Honest.
Right. And I did a short deep dive on the specs. I think that it's just over time, more comes out. But my first impression is that if I were an A7R, if I still shot with an A7R4, I would be super stoked out of my mind right now. That being said, they did not do nearly enough to get me back to the A7R series, in my opinion. It seems like they've fixed a lot of the issues. The autofocus is apparently much better. The screen is apparently much better. And yeah, I just, they did a lot, but I don't think they did enough to bring me back to the A7R series.
What do you think about the price? It coming in at $400 more at launch than I guess this question is for both of you guys, versus the Sony A7R4.
It makes complete sense to me, honestly. With inflation and everything else, when there was rumors that it was going to be 4,000, so 500 more, I was like, I understand it's $100 difference, but for some reason mentally, it makes a ton of sense.
I think it's helpful that it's the same price as the Canon R5 too. They didn't go and make it, even if it's $100 more, like it's still better that they had to be the same price and not just like that edge more expensive.
Right. I have to say the biggest thing is that I'm just not looking forward to the next 2 years referring to the R5 and no one have any idea what camera you're talking about, because there's two major cameras called the R5.
Or in our videos where we're going to be like, oh yeah, and the R5 has this feature.
And
the
R5 has that. And then people in the comments getting upset. So
it's like,
so interesting notation.
Sucks. Which one?
So interesting notation, guys. Right now, you're in the market for a Sony A7R camera. And right now, the Sony A7R4A, there are two versions of this Sony A7R4. There's the original and the A version. The main difference, just in case you missed it in the past when it was the big news like a year ago, they just upped the screen resolution quite a bit on the A7R4A. Right now, you can get it new for $2,998. So you save yourself $1,000-ish and go to the A7R4 versus the A7R5. Are there enough differences? And who do you feel like maybe what kind of photographer would it be better for, one or the other?
Man, like, I mean, it's a lot of usability. I mean, I think the video is a lot better now. I still don't think the video is awesome. It's clearly not geared towards video, and it's not a hybrid camera. It's a stills camera that can do some decent video. From what I understand, the sensor readout is not great. So there's a lot of rolling shutter, particularly in 8K. It's borderline unusable. You can't move the camera really at all from what I've seen. As far as like, so if you're a video shooter, I don't know why you'd be looking at this camera. I mean, unless you had to have 8K and you could not get the A1, and you shoot Sony, I just don't think that it makes any sense as far as that goes. So you're a still shooter, right? So landscape, product, portrait, and some wildlife. Again, I think that the A1 is like, I'm basing a lot off of like other people's experiences. And generally speaking, I would say everybody, if you kind of do a roundup of what everybody's opinion who's used this camera is that it's pretty good. I don't think anybody was blown away by it. So we have someone commented, currently have the A7 for worth the upgrade. I use the A7 for video, but got it also to use for photos.
For sure.
So
very nice.
I think my opinion on it is that it's a really good, and maybe even a really good hybrid camera for somebody who does slow image quality work. So like I think like a 2015 National Geographic photographer who focuses mostly on, I guess maybe the 2015 doesn't need to be a part of that, but somebody who's like a National Geographic photographer who does these landscapes where they want a lot of image quality, or maybe they do some studio stuff. And then with video, they want that quality to still be there, but they aren't doing a ton of stuff where they're having to move around a bunch. They're not putting on a gimbal. They're not like, it's the opposite of a sports camera. They're trying to just shoot high quality, very slow moving situations.
Right. I mean, it does have, let's see, actually, I can jump into the B&H spec page because it is the all-knowing. I'm curious what the frame rate is. That's actually something not a lot of people talked about.
I think it was
mechanical shutter, 10 frames a second at 61 megapixel. So it's still just 10 FPS.
And it looks like
it has an electronic shutter up to 7. Interesting.
And it looks like it's up to 583 frames.
So they really fixed the buffer on it.
That's a lot.
Wow,
in
that's
RAW
great
mode.
buffer. Wow, that is great buffer.
1,000 in JPEG.
Okay, so if you're a wildlife shooter, then I think that this camera actually is pretty good. I mean, like, that's a deep buffer.
Well, and it has the ability for you to do the 26 megapixel shots and the 16, I believe. You can basically downsample your shots in camera now. So.
Oh wow. Okay.
So if you're shooting.
Oh yes, that is one of the features I saw. Yeah. So. Okay, so maybe we should do.
So on the A7. So I just wanted to real quickly jump in and say that the in the previous camera, looking at the A7R4A, it says continuous shooting up to 10 frames per second at 61 megapixels for up to 68 frames. JPEG is the only thing that they're referencing on the spec sheet on B&H is what I'm referencing. Now I'm sure we could hunt down the Sony A7R4A's raw buffer. But in this particular situation, they didn't even include it on the spec sheet here, so you can kind of do the math yourself. It's not gonna last very long. That is a massive change. It's just for the comparison. It's 68 frames in JPEG mode, and it went all the way up to 1,000 frames in JPEG mode.
Now,
which
I'm going to assume that this is CF Express Type A.
Probably has to be, yeah.
Like, there's no way that you're doing that with a SD card. It does still take SD cards, which there was some concern for a minute. There has never been more leaks with a Sony camera than this one. I feel like it was leak city. Like, we pretty much knew what we were getting. The multi-tilt back screen we didn't know about.
Yeah, that was
but
cool.
As far right, and which is super cool. So I'm actually going to jump back on to B&H here. We are not sponsored by B&H, but they're welcome to if they'd like to. So this screen is what I'm talking about. And it's so cool. So it flips out to the side, but it also flips on the back like the A7R4. So you kind of have best of both worlds. And all the videos I watched said that it is absolutely amazing. So
I think maybe Gerald Undone was saying that it's still pretty stable too. Because my main concern when I saw that was that it was going to be really wobbly or feel like it's unstable and like it'll break off easily. But I believe it was Gerald Undone made it seem like
it looks beefy. The pictures, it looks beefy. So, which is like I used the A7 IV, Toby used the A7 IV and the A7S3. And the flip screen on that one was maybe not as beefy as this appears to be.
Yeah, I mean, I might have slightly broke my A7 S3's screen where it like would wobble all the time, like it wasn't tight. And
wow, I can't believe you broke a camera screen. That sucks.
Yeah, and then I sold the camera to Brandon, and then he shattered the back screen. But totally different story. Totally different.
Tune into our show from last week if you want the full story on that.
Full story.
As far as other body designs. Oh no, go ahead.
Well, I did want to jump in really quick and talk about the video upgrade here, because in an absolute sense, it's pretty disappointing. We've got 4K 60, which I remember was something people wanted the A7 the A7R4 to have back in 2019. Right. We all kind of thought it was going to have 4K 60, didn't end up having that. Really, the only major upgrade it had was it didn't have a record limit and didn't have any overheating issues. Previously, our recording options were XAVC-S in 4K up to 30p at 60 to 100 megabits per second in 1080p. So essentially, we're talking about a camera that would have been up to date in 2018. Spec sheet wise, we're talking about shooting 8-bit with S-Log. And what I feel like we have here is we have Sony bringing the Sony A7R series up to a respectable level, which is really nice, especially if you're someone who owns multiple Sony bodies, wants a stills camera, but also wants it to support well for video. We've got H.265, which is also in an XAVC HS wrapper, which is very, very efficient on your cards.
And that's on the R5, right?
It's on the A7R5 with its upgrade, and that's 10-bit. So we have 10-bit in 4K. There is a lot of idiosyncrasies within the video recording modes, and I highly recommend Gerald Undone's video to at least peruse the details there. The main glaring issue here to me is there's no 4K 120 frames per second. There's no... Well, it's a little complicated with the full frame mode. They're like most of the modes kind of have a crop, but the crop modes have downsampling going on. And it's like with every Sony A7R camera since the beginning of time, the video is just wonky. It doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean it's unusable. It's just weird. You know, you have a 1.2x crop in 4K 60. Which is binned, but you can't shoot it in APS-C mode. The APS-C mode is downsampled by 6.2K, so it might be some of the sharpest footage you can get. But the full frame mode is the full frame mode on it is binned, so just slightly sharper, if sharper at all, than the Sony A7S III. But then you have a 1.2x crop, and you're downsampling from 8K. very messy. So if you buy this camera, the thing that I recommend is you really need to understand the different little modes, because there's a lot of them here in different frame rates and crop options, and the image quality is going to be significantly different from the different recording options we have here.
Well, and something that bothers me about that a little bit too is that if you're shooting video and you're changing between some of these different settings, you're going to really have to pay attention. You're not going to be able to just kind of like, you know, there's not like 3 different options, or you can shoot 4K 120 and not worry about it or whatever. Right. You're going to have to really be thinking about what your settings are.
Yeah.
Just taking up a little bit more mental capacity.
Yeah. I'd like to zoom out for a second on this camera and just talk about it like from a more global general standpoint, like even from the fact that it's still 61 megapixels. I think that in my first take on this camera is that if this camera had come out a year ago, when I think a lot of people were expecting it, I think it would have been a bigger deal than it is now. It feels a little, and that is almost certainly not Sony's fault. That is almost certainly supply chain issues and all that stuff. It feels like a really great 2021 camera. I feel like 2022 going into 2023, it just feels like it's going to be out of date sooner than the other A7R cameras. I think people were expecting another megapixel bump because it's just been long enough. The A7R3 came out quicker after the A7R2. It was more of like a little spec bump, and it really, like, having used both I've used all the A7R cameras from the A7R2 on, and the A7R2 to A7R3 was a mind-blowing jump. Like, it went from a camera that was very frustrating to use, that I'm used with manual focus most of the time. I had to bring 4 batteries for a 2-hour shoot. It felt like, I don't know if it's quite that bad, but it was close to a camera with a single battery that would last all day, great autofocus. The IBIS was great, and had the same megapixels, but it was a huge jump in usability. And the A7R4 was, the autofocus was good, not great for 61 megapixels. I think we've talked about that, quite a bit. And it seems like they fixed that quite a bit. But I feel like the A7R5 is another one of those, like, it's like a spec bump. It's not even as significant from the R2 to the R3, I don't think. If you guys disagree or someone in the chat disagrees, I'd be very interested in that. But it just doesn't feel like that big. I mean, it's got better autofocus, but from, watching some of the videos of people using it, it's still, it's different than the A1, but it's not better. They've definitely protected the A1.
Well, and I heard,
especially.
Oh, well, and I heard in one video that the way that the interface is implemented might need a little bit of refinement, which isn't surprising, and I wouldn't hold that against the camera or Sony. But one of the videos I was looking at mentioned that it's very erratic with the subject detection in how it presents it to you, the actual camera operator. So it'll look like it's shooting from the person's eye to the person's hat to the person's torso to something in the background, and then back up, thinking that it's finding faces and different things around in the image. But if you just turn your sensitivity settings down to any sort of reasonable degree, the camera's keeping track of what you really want to be focused on and not actually like jumping to those things necessarily. But that is a significant amount of anxiety.
Right.
Showing you that it knows where they are, and that it also might be jumping to those things. And if you're like shooting a wedding, I could see that being pretty frustrating with all the faces that are actually in a frame at any given time.
Mm-hmm.
And it could just be like, oh my gosh, like it's going to jump back there. And you might want to be conscientious, like you always have to be anyway. But it's just like, if that interface is really seeming like it's uncertain of what it wants to focus on, that could be kind of frustrating.
It does
could be
seem
frustrating.
like
right.
Sorry. was just gonna say, it seems like the camera gives you a little bit more to think about instead of taking a little bit like of that off your plate. So kind of in multiple different areas. Same with the video and whatnot.
I mean, I guess that's a good thing, bad thing, right? I want a camera that I can really feel like I can utilize and use and has great autofocus and allows me to change things and focus on what I want to focus on. But if the interface is kind of wild all over the place, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'd have to really have an opinion on that. That's something I'd have to use it. So,
well, and you'd also,
again, for landscape photography, probably not dealing with that issue at all. For landscape photography, what I would hope that it fixes is that with the A7R4, I felt like it just wasn't always spot on accurate. I feel like sometimes it was, and with certain lenses it was, like with the 135-1.8, the A7R4 and the 135-1.8 were a perfect couple. Like it would nail the autofocus with that thing, and I really felt those 61 megapixels in a major way with that camera lens combo. One of my favorite pictures that I took of the maroon bells was with that, and it was kind of zoomed in, and it was a great one of my favorite shots. With other lenses, especially with some of the zooms now, with these newer 2.8, 7200 and 2470, I doubt you'd have that issue. But with the old 2470 and the old 7200 and some of the other older lenses, I felt like it was all over the place. The 24-105, it would just miss, and you just never felt that 61 megapixel glory that you were looking for. So if this new autofocus system has super great tracking and is really super accurate, ups that accuracy level that was kind of missing with the A7R 4. It's kind of funny. I was using the A7R4 and the A7R3 at the same time, and I found myself that if I was in a situation where I really wanted to nail the shot, I reached for the A7R3 just because I felt like there'd be a chance there I'd have frames out of focus with the R4. And I know a lot of people took a lot of great shots with the A7R4. So, but that was just my experience with it. So
well,
if
that might
the A7R5,
might also be your specific style of doing panoramas makes that a little bit more of a problem.
That's true.
Yeah. So if you're like trying to shoot panoramas and you're trying to keep it in continuous autofocus, which is definitely, I think, the way to go with Sony in most situations. I know that you struggled with like this frame's in focus, the next frame's out of focus. And it makes it hard to do like, if you're not like on a tripod where you can just take the same shot like 3 times just to be safe, which is what a lot of landscape photography looks like. But maybe with this new AF system, it could be a little bit more streamlined for your kind of work and work more in that direction with like sports and wildlife where you're hand holding it and relying on the continuous autofocus.
That is a really good point. A lot of my photography, I do handheld, and then I do the panoramas. And, if you're on a tripod, it's pretty easy to lock in focus. You may even use manual focus. With the A7R4, I actually did when I was using a tripod. I would use manual focus. I like using autofocus. Generally speaking, I feel like, it's less. It's leaving a one less variable to your own human error. Like, manual focus is great, but if you can take something like that off the table and devote more brain space to creativity, composition, what you want to shoot, how you want to shoot it, and not have to be worrying so much about autofocus and manual focus and all that stuff, that's really great. But that's also a good point. If you're just shooting a single frame from a tripod, you probably did not have much problems with the A7R4, especially if you use manual focus.
Yeah. Well, and something to note too is this is still the highest megapixel camera, so we have on the market anyway. So if they're able to fix the autofocus, Sony's really fulfilling that it is the highest usable megapixel camera on the market now for full frame, I should say.
Yeah. No. Yeah. We have to give it credit for that, because here we are. We're talking about how it's been forever since Sony has released an A7R camera, right? 2019. and no one has caught up, in the full frame market. Not really. Sigma has something, but I'm talking about cameras that people actually buy. You know what I'm saying?
It's the Sigma F something. It's not the Sigma FP. It's the Sigma. No, it literally is 61 megapixels. It's like the Sigma FP, but it has 61 megapixels in it.
Right.
And that is the case. And I guess that always comes down to the question of, we made a video a while ago about the Sony A7R5 predictions. And it ended up being a little less impressive than our small bump guess that we had.
It actually honestly is a little less impressive than what we had as the small bump.
And I know that we did a little poll on the channel, so I may try to pull that up for us to reference real quick. But I was going to ask while I pull that up, Brandon, you just left Sony. Is this camera giving you any feelings of remorse having just left?
No, it's not. And my camera going out during live streams is also not giving me remorse. I like I was kind of saying earlier, I could see a world in which I would like this camera, but I would have to do landscape, maybe wildlife, or in studio portraiture as or product photography as my main thing. Like, why is it doing that? Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, we can still hear you great.
I'm just going to switch to my webcam because I'm not sure what's going on. I apologize, everybody. All right.
It is a Sony camera that's doing this. No, just kidding.
Yes, I was going to, I'm not sure what's going on, but yeah, like, I think it's cool. And I want to give Sony some credit for the high qualityness to this camera, but I switched mostly because I wanted to get into hybrid shooting, and high quality hybrid shooting on both ends. So I think this camera could arguably be said to do that, but not in a way that is functional for like very versatile shooting. It's if you want to go and you want to put your camera on a tripod to do video, so you don't get the rolling shutter, or you want to do like more like landscape photography or slower studio shooting. So I guess, yeah, that's kind of my opinion.
Right. But you do a lot of studio and portrait and product. So
true. But
it's almost there for you, but
yeah, it's almost. And then also, once again, like if you had no need for like 4K 120, or in my R3 I have 1080 240, which is, I'm very excited about that feature. The R5 has neither of those, so it makes it a little bit harder to win
it is a hard sell on a true hybrid camera. Yeah, the A7RV.
The A7RV, yes.
I think for this video, we have to assume we're going to have to use the Canon R5 moniker for this video.
Speaking of the Canon R5, I'm a little torn. If you literally put them in front of me on a desk, and keep in mind, I'm mostly a video shooter. Right. I have they're frustrating. And I think that probably doesn't look great for Sony, considering the Canon R5 is 2 years old now.
Yep.
Yeah.
But I will say that there are some aspects to the Sony A7R5 that even for me might put it a little over, depending on what you shoot. The Canon R5, it is very nice. You have no record limits, and it does not appear that you have any overheating concerns. I did hear that the camera can get so hot that it's uncomfortable to hold when shooting 8K in particular. But you should be able to still get nearly 2 hours of recording unstopped with it.
Put it on tripod.
Yep.
Indeed. And that's a pretty big deal. The elephant in the room is that the camera doesn't have 4K 120, and I am fairly torn on if this matters or not. I think that it matters depending on the project you're shooting. Like we did a horse trail race shoot recently where the fact that I had 4K 120 made the project. It made it so much better. It's giving me so much more flexibility in the edit for that client. And just that's a real world example of it being a big deal. I would also argue that it's a big deal for a certain type of wedding stuff. I know some wedding videographers that do amazing work at 24p and don't need slow motion. But it's one of those things where as a professional videographer and this isn't a professional video camera. I don't think Sony's really trying to make that argument, but a lot of professionals are under the pressure of shooting professional video and professional stills. And it remains true that the A1 is the only camera that kind of checks every box. And I don't know if that's a little bit of Sony. There's a part of it to me that feels a little bit like Sony is handicapping this camera. They chose to not give it 4K 120 because if it had 4K 120, the S3 becomes very questionable on how useful it is. In the lineup of course, this camera has worse rolling shutter and some other issues like that. And of course, I'm speaking to it as a videographer. And, to me, I think it's a little bit of a tricky conversation. I would probably take the R5C. Just kidding. I literally did take the R5C as the have it all winner camera. But what I'd like to do is if you guys could now compare the two cameras from a stills perspective, because I feel like that would be a place where this camera could actually outperform the Canon because of the more megapixels and the updated autofocusing system and stuff. Could you guys see it being a better investment for still?
Okay. So I have not used the A7RV. It just came out, but having used the Canon R5 a lot, if you tell me that the A7R5 has basically the same autofocus as the Canon R5, and you're like, it has 61 megapixels, I probably, if you take all the other factors off the table, like the fact that I like the Canon lens is better and stuff like that, I probably go for that. I like the extra megapixels. So if I was in Sony right now, I think I would probably pause and be like, oh yeah, this is, but it doesn't bring a lot more to the table from stills. And I think honestly, if you need, like, the R5, it shoots 20 frames a second now. It's an electronic shutter. The Canon R5, whoa, man, this is tricky. The dangerous. Canon R5 shoots 20 frames a second with electronic shutter. You do get some distortion with that mode, but it's not that bad. It's really not. It's not like the Z9, A1, A9 from Sony and Nikon, and the R3, which doesn't have any. But it's not that bad. The readout on the Canon R5 seems to be a little bit better. So that extra 20 megapixels, the difference between 45 and 61, the law of diminishing returns, as we talked about last week with megapixels, it definitely applies where it's a little better. But honestly, I think basically what I'm saying is that I think Canon really nailed it 2 years ago with the Canon R5 because it has a extremely usable autofocus system that's extremely accurate. The image quality is great. So it's kind of weird. It kind of caught up in a lot of regards. You do that, get that few extra megapixels, but man, I don't know. And when you do bring in the other factors like the lenses and stuff, the RF zoom lenses especially, well, any of the RF lenses, then I'm reaching for the R5.
Yeah, I think for me it's like, this is a lot less of an exciting answer, but I think it's just whatever system I'm in then. If I'm only doing stills, so That has to kind of remain the one factor. The lens I reached for first with Canon was the 28-70 f2, which is just a beautiful lens. Like, so in that sense, yes, like, I'm probably like going to Canon then for the R5. But that also being said, I can also see myself, if I was still with Sony, maybe like on the 51-2 from Sony is just a beautiful lens too. And the 135-1.8, that's also gorgeous. So if I'm wanting to use, or like the 20 or 24-1.4, or the 24-1.4 or the 20-1.8, those would just be awesome. But I think of something that we don't know as much about is the, or I haven't seen anything on it, is how bad noise affects the images. Because I know that the R4 wasn't bad. The Sony A7R4 wasn't bad, but it wasn't also super, super amazing. Like, you had to be shooting.
It was not super amazing. As far as the high ISO, I didn't want to crank it as high as I would with the Sony R3. And honestly, the Canon R5, the Nikon Z9, the Canon R3, the low light is amazing.
Like, you can shoot it like
stunning. Yeah, it's stunning. But as far as those cameras, like with similar megapixels, Z7 1 and Z7 2, I would probably do a couple stops brighter ISO on those, just from my experience, than I would with the Sony A7R4 and the A7R5. It has a better processor, so there's a chance it's a little bit better, but I'm guessing it's about the same.
And see, I think what happens to me is when I'm thinking about megapixels, you get barely more megapixels, which you lose a lot, or like, which I feel like you don't feel as much, but you lose more with low light performance than it's worth, I guess, is my thought process. If you're somebody who shoots in low light conditions. If you don't, once again, going back to the studio situation, if you're shooting in studio, you can have 100 ISO, like, when, like, you don't have to ever think about it. So if you're a studio photographer, it seems like an awesome thing.
Something that the guys from DP Review brought up in their video, which, again, if you're watching this, I would strongly recommend. This is basically an opinion, our opinion about it. If you want kind of some real life use and like a blow by blow of the specs, some of those other videos like the DP Review, Gerald Undone, Jared Polin, the Northrops, they all made videos where they actually got to use it. So this is just kind of our reaction to all of that. But in that DP Review video, he talked about being very disappointed that this camera did not have the mechanical shutter of the A1, which allowed it to have a higher flash sync speed. And when he said that, I'm like, oh yeah, that was a huge mistake.
I forgot about that.
Because this is a studio camera, and this is the camera you might want that for. And they kind of kept that buried in the A1. And it's very obvious that Sony is protecting the A1. They did it with the A7 IV, and they're doing it with the R5 as well. That they're trying to keep the A1 the top of their lineup. So,
well, I mean, you say that though, and there's the questionable decision that the Sony A7R5 might legitimately have. Well, it does have Sony's most cutting edge autofocus technology. And there's stuff like focus breathing compensation that these new cameras have, and slightly updated menus that these new cameras have. And it's like, I heard the point brought up quite a bit, and I think a lot of people using A1s might feel me on this, is like, Sony's made a lot of big improvements on quality of life improvements is the word that I want to use with the Sony A7S III, the Sony A7 IV, and the Sony A7R5. All of these cameras have all these quality of life upgrades that are a pretty big deal. So like, if you're using an A1 at this point, you're missing a lot of you're just using a much older feeling Sony body without a lot of these quality of life stuff that people who are paying much less are getting on their bodies.
like the dial on top, oh my goodness, like where it switches between
video
stills and video
stills right here.
S and Q.
That is that's a huge deal. And like and then you have double the custom modes because you don't have to have different ones. I mean, you don't have to use the same ones for stills and video, which the A1 had, which is a huge issue. I'm looking for one that shows the top of the camera a little bit better. That one I guess does. So like on the A1, you have the mode 1, 2, and 3 right here. You had to use those on a mixture between stills and video. And now you have 1, 2, and 3 for stills and 1, 2, and 3 for video. And that's on the A7 IV as well. That's actually a huge deal for professionals.
Yeah.
Those custom modes are a huge deal. I mean, I live in my custom modes on my various cameras, and yeah, I don't know.
Well, and then also the two. Oh, go ahead, Brandon.
I was just going to say, in Sony's defense, Sony does tend to roll out some of their new technology in the R series bodies. So it's probably them implementing, or this will be implemented in the next, A1 Mark II or whatever it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
I would hope anyways. If not, then there's a whole different situation.
Mohammed Ramadan asks, did the color output get any better? I know the A1 is getting better in colors output. I don't think we know the answer to that. I think
we can speak
let me look in the specs a little bit.
Well, we can speak to the fact that the color for video, if that's what you're asking, which I'm not sure if that's what you're asking. For video, your colors are going to be way, way better because this is a 10-bit camera and you were shooting on an 8-bit camera before. So particularly skin tones are going to be improved a lot.
He's comparing it to the A1.
In the A1's case, it's going to be essentially the same or slightly worse in video mode for colors, just because the A1 might have.
He is talking about. He is talking about for photos. So
okay, so he's talking for photos. I have no clue.
It's 14-bit. I don't know if the color science is any better. The A1 had excellent color science. I made a whole video about the A1 that I used it for a couple months last year. The color science in the A1 is great. I can only assume that the R5 gets that same color science, but it's probably very similar. It is unfortunately still 14-bit raw. There was a day and a half. See, it says it is where was it that I just was looking at it on here? There was a day and a half where we thought it might get 16-bit raw, which would have been a huge deal. Here it is. Bit depth is 14-bit for
it did. I do believe it did get 15 or 16-bit raw though through HDMI for video, which is not answering your question, but that's kind of a cool feature.
Oh,
yes, they did. They did get that in there via HDMI.
Oh, which wow,
maybe
that's
what that rumor was actually.
That is almost certainly what that rumor was addressing. I am very excited for the day that we get 16-bit in stills in cameras, because it does make a difference. Now, I've used it only on the Fuji GFX 100S, and it is really nice having that many more colors. I forget how many millions or billions of colors is the difference between 14 and 16, but it definitely is going to allow for more colors. And I think honestly, both Brandon and I, we were talking about it when we saw for a second 16-bit on there. We were like, oh no, like we're gonna want this camera because it has 16-bit. But alas, no, it is 14, the same as pretty much everything else right now. And real world people debate it. Like some people shoot in 12-bit and are like, yeah, it doesn't make any difference.
Some people shoot
12,
in JPEG
14. Yeah.
I mean, like a lot of
but if you're really truly looking for the best color you can get, you want 16-bit. People want I think we would be willing to sacrifice a lot. Like, it wouldn't be able to shoot continuous. Sure, that's fine. I don't need it to for a 16-bit image. I would just love for the camera companies to give us that. It was rumored the Z9 was going to have 16-bit for a minute, and I was super stoked about that. So anyway, actually, speaking of the Z9, should we soon talk about the fact that they announced firmware 3.0 today on the same day as A7R5? Which, come on, Nikon.
Give them their day.
Well,
but I'll let Toby have his thought before we talk about that.
Well, what I was gonna ask was, do any of the, because I actually don't know this, because my brain is full of video numbers and codecs and wrappers and stuff.
Yes,
I don't actually know. Does Canon, Nikon, Sony have a 16-bit camera anywhere in them? Because it seems, I don't think they do. I think you have to go to Fuji.
If someone watching this video knows differently, I'd love to know, but I do not think there's a mirrorless camera from the big companies that has 16-bit RAW in stills.
Is that a processing thing or is it a sensor thing? Do you know? Or I guess both.
It's probably both. It's probably a bit of both. But sensor, I don't. You know what? I don't know. I would love to know.
I was just curious.
Yeah, it's yeah.
Sounds like a video.
There's, to my knowledge, it sounds like a video we need to deep dive on. So,
well, I mean, obviously, it's shooting 16-bit in video mode. I do want to say that I have heard, this is my understanding, that it's only sort of, it's 16-bit mathematically only. It's not really 16-bit in a practical sense. It's more like 12-bit in what it actually renders out. And exactly all the workings within that or why that's the case.
You mean for
not
video
totally
or
sure.
stills
for video?
Oh,
for the
video.
16-bit RAW. But my point is that in theory, Sony at least is saying that their sensor's capable of 16-bit by default, and that literally their processor, you'd need a big beefy external recorder to record 16-bit RAW off of it. So that would hint to it being a processor issue, because the number of colors, I'd have no clue what 16-bit would be, but it's a lot of colors. It's many different number calculations.
Colors. The difference between 8-bit and 10-bit for video is like, it's a huge deal.
I'm gonna Google it real quick.
Okay.
All right. While you're doing that, let's go ahead and talk about this Z9 firmware 3.0 update, because I mean, it's certainly not as great as the firmware 2.0 update that like rocked the photography world for a second, made a whole video about it. But it's decent. I think the headlining feature is that it added high-res zoom to video. So it basically uses the 8K recording capability, and this is the Nikon Z9 we're talking about now. The 8K video recording to allow you to zoom in and out. I watched some demos of it, and it's actually super cool. So it just allows you to use buttons on the camera to zoom in and out like a zoom lens. Super smooth. It only goes straight into this. It's similar to clear image zoom, I think, that Sony has. So, but it just uses the 8K, so it maintains a really high image quality. This is interesting, Brandon. You were just complaining about the R3 on this. The Z9 added the ability to rotate tall item in the playback menu is now, you will auto rotate to whatever direction you are have the camera. So that's something you said you missed from Sony in the R3, and now the Z9 has that. So that's funny.
I didn't realize that was a thing that was like, I guess, Sony exclusive. Maybe not exclusive, but it was such a common feature that I was just used to in Sony. And
right, for stills photography, it now allows you to shoot large, medium, and small RAW files in APS-C, which it calls DX in Nikon. In Nikonese, it's DX, but that means APS-C. So I guess that's nice. I don't know who was asking for that, but because you're already getting a much smaller file with APS-C anyway. So
you just need a really small file.
It added C60 to the frame rates available for high-speed frame capture. So basically, you know how it added that, or it had that 120 frames a second for JPEG stills. It now gives you a kind of middle ground between 30 and 120 with 60. So I guess that's, again, if you're using the 120, I guess it gives you a balance. But again, I doubt this is going to be the most used feature. But they also apparently made the autofocus better. I tell you what, I will put it on my Z9 this week and do some autofocus tests and see if I feel like it's better.
Talk about it next week. Same time.
Other changes. So it says improved autofocus accuracy, improved low light autofocus performance, reduced the sensitivity of 3D tracking to objects passing between subject and camera. So that's good. Improved focus performance when animal is selected. Reduce the tendency of the camera to focus on the background during subject detection when wide AF area and 3D tracking and auto area AF are selected. Whoa. He says a mouthful, some of this. Boy, there is a lot of little stuff. And there's a bunch of issues. Shutters, improved manual focus response in video mode, and when silent mode is selected during still photography. Interesting. The shooting display now shows synchronized release connection status. Whoa, that was super critical, guys.
This sounds like I always think it's funny when camera brands like sync stuff up like this, because it's like, you know that this is like Nikon just being like, hey guys, I know that we charged you $1,500 more for a camera that is significantly better than the Sony A7RV.
Right.
Wow, I'm being bold here, guys. I'm saying it's significantly better. I must say though, right now, Nikon has the weirdest camera lineup you could ask for. It's so strange.
It is so weird. And I'm actually working on so if you're watching this, it's behind the scenes. I'm actually working on a script right now because with starting this new production company and all this stuff with our YouTube channel. We've been trying out cameras and buying and selling. It's been a whole process. But I've been actually writing a script for a video, basically like what I like about Canon, Nikon, and Sony, and then what I dislike about them. And I'm just gonna do sneak peek. Major dislike on Nikon is that their system is the Z9 right now, as far as a modern competitive camera. The Z7 II is great for
landscape.
Is great for landscape, and the Z6 II is a decent camera. But if you've used one of the more modern Canon and Sony cameras, it's behind. I'm sorry, guys. The image quality is great, but it is behind. So it's so weird. Nikon it's neck and neck, but it's just the Z9. It's one camera, whereas both Sony and Canon have a variety of different ones that are kind of neck and neck. The Nikon, it's Z9 or bust, and Nikon seems to know it and is putting a ton of effort into keeping it as updated as possible. That being said, the Z9 is so good, like it works, I guess, and it's
significantly cheaper too. So
it's significantly cheaper than the A1 and the Canon R3, and so. And the
it's interesting. It's interesting that there's a lot of cameras right now that are, because you have the R5 now and you have both R5s. You have Sony's and Canon's R5s coming in at about $4,000. You're going to have a really hard time getting, since the R5 is a little older, you can get it used for under $4,000, but with like something like the Sony or buying a Canon R5 new, you're going to be paying with taxes where you're over $4,000 for those cameras. So It is interesting. And obviously there's inflation that's factoring into some of that, but it's Sony A7R2 was like $3,200 when it came out, and we are just creeping up that price point.
I'm pretty sure the
to the point
R3
where
was also 32.
Yeah, 32, 33, I think it was.
32, 33. So
and
it's
then
like
the R4 was 35, and then now we're at 39. 30. Yeah, I mean, it is. You're right. It's creeping up.
It's a big jump. And I also feel like it's once again, there's evidence of that cameras, the more expensive cameras are the most important ones, and they're pouring a lot of effort into them. If I have a critique for Sony right now, though, it's that they're releasing a lot of really good cameras. Like, that camera is going to take really good photos and can make really good videos. No denying it with Sony's most recent releases. But it has been a while since Sony has put in a feature or something along those lines that's been like, that's really exciting. And I feel like Canon has had, well, the Canon R5 was a big hype camera. People got really excited about it. And, you know, Nikon had the Z9. And I just feel like right now I'm looking at Sony and I'm like, I just don't feel like Sony's supposed to be the one that releases stuff that gets us excited and is like, whoa, that's industry leader, or at least they're pushing the bounds of what's possible. And in theory, I think you can make an argument that the Sony A7R4, just by the very fact that it's 61 megapixels, which is still the megapixel king, for the main three brands.
King.
But there's a part of me that's like, double down on that, Sony, because now we know that Canon's going to release their replacement camera before this camera gets replaced. So that's the Canon R5 Mark II. That's going to be coming, and this camera is going to have to go toe to toe with that camera. And just the very fact that it's so close as it stands, I think is a little scary for me for Sony's sake. And the same thing's true about the A7 IV. Now we have the R6 Mark II coming out, and we probably have a Z6 II coming out. And because
Z6
Sony
III.
just Z6 III.
Oh yeah, weird.
Just because the A7 IV barely outdid the competition, it's like, well, now the competition is going to walk in with their improvements and just outdo the Sony A7 IV. So just to Sony, I would like to ask for just like, I guess maybe I miss old Sony a little bit with impressive things, but I also respect.
I think that's actually, I had that exact thought today. I was like, man, I remember when the A7R3 came out, even then, because the thing that the A7R3 had was a total body redesign. Like, that was the camera where they really started the body redesign, and then they improved it even more on the A7R4, and now the A7R5 it's the flip screen, which is great, but it's not a total redesign. I just remember the old days of Sony and the A7R2, and you were just like, and then the A7 III when that was announced, and you were just like, it really was those mind-blowing moments of like, wow, Sony is crazy.
So sharp. This is so cool. This is so
Well, it's like they did 20 frames per second with like essentially no rolling shutter on a camera. They did that first. It's like, even though the A9 wasn't for everybody, it's still like, dang, like that's.
I remember holding that camera and being like, this is the future. I mean, it couldn't be my main camera at the time, but I remember being like, it's the future. And then, now when I'm using the Z9, the Z9 is building on the back of that original A9. So I agree. Well, I mean, I wish that the A7R5 was a 100 megapixel, like pushing the ceiling of what the A7R series was originally intended to be. I feel like, and it's still doing that. It has taken the A7R4 and probably perfected it. Like, if this camera had been the A7R4, I think I never would have left Sony for sure.
Also, I think the Sony A7R5 is one feature short of being that mind-blowing camera. Like they needed to put just one thing, and it could have already been something that's already been done, like 4K 120. Like if 4K 120 was in it, or 100 megapixels, or it doesn't need to be 100, but like 81
well,
or something.
It does have, we haven't talked about the pixel shift shooting mode, which is apparently a lot more usable. I don't know that it's 100%, every shot you take with it can be pixel shift now. I don't think that's the case, but it detects movement and is apparently a lot more usable. The big issue with that is that it doesn't build it in camera. You have to use Sony's software. And it's just, it's a barrier to, being able to get the most out of it. But that being said, I think it's like 240 megapixels.
It's
beautiful, who knows? Maybe it is. I wonder if that's something we could look up.
Probably isn't technically, but the colors are still usually better when you're overlaying it because of the software, the way that it's moving the sensor and exposing the different color sensitive the different color sensitive pixels, because not every pixel only sees one color. That's how these CMOS sensors work. So because you're moving the sensor around, that one spot or that one pixel is actually getting a blue pixel and a green pixel and a red pixel. And that can just improve your color accuracy, reduce things like banding, and give you a more rich image. I doubt that it actually increases the bit depth.
Right, but it's still giving you a fantastic image. And if that's more usable, that's a huge plus. But again, like I said, it doesn't build it in camera. It requires a lot of kind of effort to get to implement. And like, remember the Panasonic S1R?
Mm-hmm.
It did that where it built it in camera and it was great. And it had movement detection. And that was back in 2019. That was released before the A7R4. And it did it. So I don't know why they can't have it build it in camera. You have this camera with a processor that you're like flexing is the greatest processor of all time. And you're not being able to do this stuff in camera when Panasonic was doing it, years ago now, like 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. That's kind
everything,
of weird,
with that kind of thing in camera is clutch. It just is, because we don't.
It just is.
It's not. Well, if Lightroom did it, that would be different.
Even if Lightroom did it. But the fact that you've got to get those files over to Sony and then get it build it and then get it back into Lightroom, it's not like I wouldn't do it for certain situations, but that's it. I wouldn't use it for all situations. And, if it built it in camera, I actually might use it all situations, and I might be looking at this camera in a different way. But because it's harder to use, it's kind of like focus stacking. It's nice to have that, but the fact that you have to do that totally externally, and even that you can do with a Lightroom plugin, so it's not that hard. But
like what was Canon's like in the 5D Mark IV, I believe. What was that focus
dual
stacking
pixel thing
where you could kind of shift it a little bit?
And everyone thought that photography had changed forever, with that you could change focus in post, and then it was so minor,
small, but also you needed you couldn't do it in Lightroom.
Right? No, you could not do it in Lightroom. Yep.
There's
a new Lightroom.
Canon.
We can talk about that at some point, but there's some pretty cool new stuff with some of that people masking stuff.
It's like Luminar style almost.
Well, before we move on from the Sony A7R5, I would like to get your guys's 0 to 10 rating. 10 being the best, you're super impressed and happy with it. 0 being the Sigma FP.
Toby
cream Sigma twice in one show.
What can I say? And then in 6 months, I'm going to make a YouTube video about how the Sigma FP is the best bang for your buck cinema camera on the market these days. Anyway, what would you guys say your rating would be? Understanding we're more or less rating how it interfaces with the market. How impressive is it on paper? We haven't actually used the camera, and that can change the camera rating massively. But I'm just kind of curious off of the read that we have when comparing it to our own cameras. If we're considering switching, I'm sure there are a lot of people that are at least considering it out there. What would you guys say?
I'm going to go. I'm going to do 6 out of 10. I think.
Yeah, I
think it's one notch better than, I would say that 5 would be neutral, like right in the middle. Like, oh, it's not good, it's not bad. I think it's one notch better than that. But I think that it's closer to mediocre than not.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit cooler than I thought it was maybe last week. Like, it's better than I thought it was going to be last week. So I'm somewhere between a 6 and a 7 with it. I think closer to a 6 when you think about the future, like when you think about the fact that all these other cameras are going to be coming out and just kind of wash over it.
Yep.
At least theoretically.
The Canon R5 Mark II, the R1. I mean, even if they're not direct competitors, the Z7 Mark III has a real shot now to make a statement against it if Nikon so chooses, which they probably do not so choose. But because why would they? Everyone's buying the super expensive Z9. Why would they?
I have a prediction for the Z7 II. Z7 III. I have a prediction for it. I think it's going to be 61 megapixels because I think Sony will have finally
sold them the sensor.
Sell them the sensor.
Yeah. I think it's going to be $3,500 because now Canon and now Nikon's whole rule about everything having to be $500 cheaper than everybody else. They can now do that and do 3,500. And I think it's going to essentially be the A7R4 but with 4K 60. And that's basically what it's going to be. That's my guess. Much better camera body, much better.
I think that's
back thing. Like, I think that's what we're going to be seeing there.
I don't think it's going to get the Z9's autofocus the same way that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it's going to be a different sensor, and who knows if they can even do that. But
who knows if they can even do it?
For me, I think, and this is from a video perspective, I think using Kemper's thing with 5 being kind of, it's fine. I would give it a 5 from a videography perspective. It did just enough to be like, yeah, I could use that camera and I'd be happy probably. But I'd be frustrated with the rolling shutter. I'd be frustrated with the weird codec options, just like having to.
You have to shoot in APS-C in a lot of ways. Like,
and that's problematic too.
It's an APS-C video camera in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and that's
the FX30 8K.
That's always been the thing though with the R series is like, and I will say in the R series defense, the footage does look good. It looks really sharp. We used to shoot plays with the Sony A7R III, I think.
We did.
And I think we shot one with the Sony A7R IV. And just like in that kind of environment, it just looks so sharp because I don't know, like it's still super usable. It's just like if I had $4,000, I would have a really hard time buying that camera unless I was like a time-lapse artist and I wanted the 61 megapixels, which is where I do think that it must get the respect to end it off with the fact that it still has 61 megapixels. And right now, that's the highest resolution, full frame camera you can buy.
They did it. They made it through 2 generations, the megapixel king, and for that, Sony, you get some applause. So
get some applause.
And with 8K now too, at least you can do really very high quality time lapses. You can do very high quality videos if you don't move it too much.
I think for next week, let's move away from just camera rumor roundtable talking, and let's do. So I think next week we should talk about the new Lightroom. And I think both Brandon and I will put some hours in it and have some first impressions. Maybe we might be able to do a demo or something with it. It's got some really cool new masking features and stuff I would love to talk about. So I think we can talk about the new Lightroom and kind of do a demo off of that. I will download the Z9 firmware and I will talk about if it seems much better and kind of give some impressions of that. So yeah, I think that's kind of a plan for next week for the live show. So if you guys enjoyed this special episode of A7R5 reactions, we would love it if you'd hit the like button and subscribe for much more photo video content coming from us. I promise we are working on getting a lot of content out. We have a really cool video about the Canon R5 in the works that I think it could be our best video ever. At least Toby tells me in the early stages that it could be our best video ever.
Could be our best camera video ever, I guess we could say.
Okay, our best camera video ever.
Best camera video ever.
The Telluride vlog was our best video.
What's your favorite? What's our best video ever, Toby?
What's the video for people to just like get whet their appetite for Summit Bid if they're new checking this out because the A7R5 hype.
Yep.
I would say, well, it's old and it's a little. I'm not gonna lie, it's a little choppy. Like the motion graphics aren't as on point. Brandon's not in it, which is a bonus. Just kidding.
Wait, what?
Yikes!
He just said that so casually. He didn't even like. There wasn't even like a ha ha ha. It was just like, and Brandon's
he's like,
not in it.
I mean, it's a huge bonus. Brandon's not in it.
That's gonna be the Colorado's hidden gem overnight at South Crestone Lake. I still think
that one is a classic. All right,
that's top tier.
I'm dropping
content.
the link to that video
top tier
in the description of this one,
and the Telluride video. Go watch that. Has
and the Telluride video. I will put that.
And I was a Sony shooter at that time, so if you're a Sony person, you can go see that.
We were all Sony shooters at that point.
We were all Sony shooters.
Oh, we had
and there was a Canon. There was a
Canon.
There
was the Canon R5 and the 100 to 400, which is a permanent resident on this channel because the 100 to 500 is my favorite lens I've ever used. Okay, with that we're ending.
Bye.
All right, bye.